Chapter 1. The Encounter. The winds of Tiberon, 7 were relentless. They swept across the dry, cracked landscape with the power of 100 storms, clawing through the broken remnants of ancient cities and the rusted skeletons of military outposts left behind by the Eutherian Empire's conquest of the planet years before. The winds didn't just carry dust and sand. They carried memories of the devastation that had torn apart the planet's once thriving civilization. Here, in the desert wasteland, there were only the echoes of a forgotten war and the lingering stench of death. It was a place where survival was a daily struggle, a world where life hung on the thinnest thread, where only the strong or the desperate dared to tread. And yet, Jonas Cade found himself here, walking the barren soil with purpose, his boots kicking up the dust beneath him, his gaze fixed on the horizon. Jonas, a former soldier turned mercenary, had grown accustomed to places like Tiberon, 7. He had seen battlefields far worse than this world scarred by war, littered with the bones of civilizations that had fought to the death for dominance. But Tiberon, 7 was different. It was more than just a battlefield. It was a graveyard, a place where the remnants of a once proud empire had fallen, leaving nothing behind but the scars of their defeat. The Imperial forces had long since retreated from this forsaken world, leaving the survivors to pick up the pieces. There were still some remnants of life in the form of scavengers, traders, and mercenaries like Jonas who roamed the wastelands, looking for anything of value in the abandoned structures and forgotten ruins. But it was clear to anyone who had spent more than a few days on Tiberon, 7 that this place was dying. It was a world on the edge, clinging to the last vestiges of life. Jonas wasn't here for anything noble. He wasn't a hero, nor was he interested in playing one. He had a simple job: find whatever salvage he could, get in, get out, and leave this hellhole behind. His ship, the Stellar Drift, was parked just outside the ruins of an old Eutherian base, a relic of the conflict that had ravaged the planet years before. The ship was a basic transport vessel, nothing fancy, just enough to get him from one world to the next, picking up jobs here and there to make ends meet. The life of a freelancer suited him fine. He wasn't tied to anyone or anything, and he liked it that way. His past was filled with too many blood-soaked memories, too many faces of people he had lost, too many lives that he had taken. So he kept his head down, focusing on the job at hand, and never allowed himself to get too close to anyone or anything that might make him feel again. Today, however, was different. There was something in the air, something that stirred the usual monotony of his existence. The winds were picking up, howling louder now, and the air felt charged, as though the very planet was preparing for something Jonas couldn't quite put his finger on. He could feel it in his bones, that nagging sense of foreboding that had followed him for most of his life. He had ignored it for so long, buried it deep under the weight of his duties and the armor he had built around himself. But now, it was impossible to ignore. As Jonas trudged through the shifting dunes, he scanned the horizon, his eyes squinting against the harsh wind and the swirling sand. That's when he saw her at first. She appeared to be just another silhouette on the edge of his vision, another lost soul wandering the desert. But then something caught his eye, the way she moved. She wasn't walking like the others. She was limping, struggling, her body hunched as if she was fighting against the very elements of the planet itself. At first, Jonas thought she might be another scavenger, but there was something in the way she carried herself, something in her posture that made him pause. She wasn't just stumbling through the desert aimlessly, she was trying to get somewhere. She had purpose. The wind howled around him, the dust stinging his face, but Jonas didn't hesitate. He moved forward, following the figure in the distance. The closer he got, the clearer it became that she was in trouble. Her body was covered in tattered armor, and there were signs of blood on her clothes, stains that had long since dried in the heat of the sun. She wasn't just some lost wanderer. She was a warrior, and by the looks of her, she had seen the horrors of war up close. Jonas quickened his pace, closing the distance between them. When he was just a few yards away, he called out to her, his voice cutting through the roar of the wind. "Hey," Jonas shouted, his voice hoarse. "You need help?" The woman didn't respond immediately. She kept walking, her head down, her shoulders slumped as though every step was a battle. But Jonas could see the faint tremor in her movements, the way her hand gripped the weapon slung across her back with a kind of desperate determination. She was fighting to survive, but it was clear that she wasn't going to make it much longer on her own. Jonas didn't wait for her to respond. He reached her side and extended a hand to steady her, his fingers brushing against her arm. The woman flinched, her eyes darting up to meet his, and for a moment, there was a flash of suspicion in her gaze. But when she saw the look on his face, the concern mixed with genuine curiosity, something in her softened. She let him guide her to the ground, where they took shelter behind a broken stone wall, blocking them from the full force of the wind. For a moment, there was only silence. Jonas didn't know what to say. He wasn't a man who spoke much. He wasn't good with words. But he could see the state she was in. She was exhausted, starving, and in pain. The blood that stained her clothes wasn't a fresh wound. It was dried, an old injury that hadn't been tended to. She needed help, and Jonas wasn't the type of man to turn his back on someone in need. "I'm not going to hurt you," Jonas said softly, his voice calm but firm. He reached into his pack and pulled out a ration bar, offering it to her. "You look like you need this more than I do." The woman eyed him warily, but the hunger in her eyes was unmistakable. She reached for the bar, her hand trembling slightly, and took it from him. She didn't say anything, but the way she bit into it told Jonas everything he needed to know. She hadn't eaten in days, maybe longer. Jonas watched her for a moment, his expression softening. She was unlike anyone he had met in a long time. There was a raw strength to her, an unspoken resilience that tugged at something deep within him. She wasn't just a wounded warrior. She was someone who had lived through the worst and kept fighting. There was something magnetic about her, something that drew him in. It wasn't just her physical beauty, though she was undeniably striking. It was the way she carried herself, the way she held herself even when everything around her was falling apart. "What's your name?" Jonas asked after a moment of silence, his curiosity getting the better of him. The woman paused, the question clearly catching her off guard. She looked up at him, her eyes narrowing for just a second before she spoke. "Kara," she said, her voice rough but steady. "Kara Veeler. And you are?" "Jonas," he replied, his hand instinctively brushing the dirt off his jacket. "Jonas Cade." She nodded slightly, her attention returning to the ration bar. She ate quickly, as though she hadn't tasted food in days, maybe weeks. Jonas didn't push her for more information. He knew how it was to be on the edge of survival. Words didn't matter when your body was too weak to speak, when your mind was consumed with the need for sustenance. After a few moments of silence, Kara spoke again, her voice barely above a whisper. "Why did you help me?" she asked, her eyes meeting his with a mixture of curiosity and suspicion. "You don't know me. You don't owe me anything." Jonas shrugged, unsure of how to answer. "Maybe I just don't like seeing people suffer," he said simply. "We're all just trying to survive, aren't we?" Kara's lips curled into a faint, wry smile. "I guess you're right," she muttered, her hand still gripping the ration bar, as if it were the most precious thing in the world. "But not everyone helps." Jonas didn't respond, knowing that the unspoken truth between them was too heavy for words. It wasn't just about survival, it was about connection, about reaching out to someone when the universe seemed determined to tear you apart. And in that moment, as Kara finished the last of the food and leaned back against the stone wall, Jonas felt something stir within him. It was a feeling he hadn't experienced in years, something warm, something human. Kara finished the last bite of the ration bar, but her eyes never left Jonas. She chewed slowly, as if savoring the food, her gaze a mixture of gratitude and wariness. When she was done, she wiped her mouth with the back of her hand and let out a soft sigh, leaning her head back against the cold, jagged stone. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The wind outside continued to howl, but here, behind the ruins of a long-abandoned Eutherian military station, there was a strange, fragile calm between them. Jonas was unsure of what to say. He had spent most of his life navigating dangerous worlds, dealing with shady contacts, and taking jobs that required a certain level of emotional detachment. He had learned not to get involved, to keep his distance from others. He didn't want to form attachments, didn't want to make himself vulnerable. But now, with Kara sitting beside him, her presence undeniable and somehow grounding, Jonas found himself questioning everything he had believed in. Why had he chosen to help her? It wasn't in his nature. He didn't do things like that. But something about her, a sense of shared hardship, an unspoken connection compelled him to do more than just walk away. After a while, Kara spoke again, her voice quieter now, more reflective. "Why are you out here, Jonas?" she asked. "This place. It's not safe. Even for someone like you." Jonas frowned at the question. "I'm just here for the salvage," he replied, avoiding her gaze. He didn't want to admit that there was more to it than just searching for old tech. He didn't want to get too personal. The ruins around here, there's always something useful. Kara gave him a skeptical look, her eyebrows raising slightly. You don't seem like a scavenger, she said, her voice tinged with suspicion. You carry yourself differently. You've got the look of someone who's seen too much. Like you've been running from something. Jonas felt a pang in his chest at her words. He wasn't sure if it was the truth, or just a gut instinct she'd picked up from his worn demeanor. But she was right, in a way. He had been running from his past, from the memories that haunted him, from the man he had once been. He had left the Eutherian military years ago, haunted by the atrocities he'd witnessed and participated in. He'd traded his uniform for the life of a contractor, always in the shadows, always alone. I guess you could say I've had my share of history, he replied, his voice tight. He turned away from her gaze, focusing on the rocky ground beneath his feet. And I'm not looking for anything more than a paycheck. It's not complicated. Kara didn't push further, though Jonas could feel the weight of her curiosity still hanging in the air between them. Instead, she looked out across the vast desert landscape, her gaze distant. I'm not just some wandering soldier. I was part of the Red Dawn, the survivalist brigade that fought back against the invaders during the early days of the war. But things didn't go well, she said, her voice low and rough, the words carrying a heaviness she couldn't hide. Jonas glanced at her, noticing the way her shoulders tensed at the mention of the past. He didn't need her to elaborate. He could see the scars, both physical and emotional, that ran deeper than just the bloodstains on her clothes. Kara had fought in a losing war, watched as everything she cared about was torn apart. He knew that feeling, that sense of helplessness, all too well. You don't need to explain, he said softly, his voice almost a whisper. I get it. She nodded but didn't say anything more. The silence between them stretched, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was as though they were both processing their own thoughts, silently acknowledging that, in this moment, they shared something, some deep, unspoken understanding. Jonas didn't know why he had helped her, but as the dust settled around them and the winds began to die down, it felt like the right decision. Suddenly, Kara turned to him, her expression more serious. What happens next? She asked, her tone blunt. What happens after we're done here? Jonas shifted uncomfortably, glancing around at the crumbling ruins. We get out of here, he said, standing up and stretching. I'll take you back to my ship. You can rest. We'll figure things out. Kara stood up as well, her movements slow but steady, her hand resting on the weapon slung across her back. Her expression softened, but only slightly. You're willing to help me more? She asked, almost incredulously. Jonas gave a small, weary smile. It's not like I have anything else to do, he said, shrugging. Besides, it's the least I can do. You've been through a hell of a lot, and I'm not just going to leave you here. For the first time, Kara looked at him as if she was truly seeing him not as a stranger or some mercenary, but as a person who was offering her something beyond just survival. She nodded, accepting the offer without any further words, and they began walking back to the wreckage of the Eutherian station. The sun had almost set by now, and the cold of the evening was beginning to settle over the desert. The sounds of the wind faded, leaving only the quiet crunch of sand beneath their boots. Jonas couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted between them, something subtle but profound. He hadn't just fed her, he had given her a chance, however small, to live. And, in turn, she had done the same for him. In this barren wasteland, where survival was the only thing that mattered, they had found something far rarer: human connection. Chapter 2. The Long Road Ahead. The Stellar Drift was a small transport vessel, barely big enough to house the two of them and the minimal cargo that Jonas carried with him. It wasn't much, but it was enough to get by. The ship was an old model, a relic of past conflicts, but it had been meticulously maintained by Jonas, its engines purring like a well-oiled machine. The interior was cramped, the walls lined with mismatched tech and old equipment. There was a small cockpit, a tiny dining area, and just enough room for a few repairs. It wasn't luxurious, but for someone like Jonas, it was all he needed. Kara stepped onto the ship first, her eyes scanning the cramped quarters with a mixture of curiosity and wariness. Jonas followed behind her, closing the hatch and sealing the door with a soft hiss. You live here? She asked, her voice laced with disbelief as she took in the small, functional space. Jonas grinned. It's not much, but it gets the job done. You get used to it. He moved toward the cockpit and started the engine, his fingers flying across the controls with ease. The hum of the ship's engines filled the cabin, the familiar sound grounding him. It was nice to have something familiar in the chaos, even if it was just the noise of a ship that had seen better days. Kara stood silently behind him for a moment before moving to one of the small chairs by the table, sinking into it with a tired sigh. "I've been on the move for too long," she muttered, almost to herself. "I don't even know where to go anymore." Jonas didn't look at her as he adjusted the ship's trajectory, but he could hear the weariness in her voice, the exhaustion that came from years of running, of fighting, of surviving. He didn't know much about her past, but he could tell it was a heavy one. "You don't have to keep running," Jonas said, his voice softer than usual as he glanced over at her. "Not anymore. You're safe here." Kara gave a faint, tired smile, but there was something bittersweet about it. "Safe? On a ship with a stranger who saved my life? I don't think I've ever truly been safe anywhere." Jonas didn't have an answer to that. He wasn't sure how to offer her the kind of reassurance she was looking for. He didn't have the right words, nor did he have the kind of life experience to truly understand what she had gone through. But he could offer her a place to rest, at least for now. That was something. And in the cold expanse of space, where everything felt like a fleeting moment, something no matter how small was enough. The stars outside the cockpit window began to twinkle as the ship lifted off, leaving Tiberon, 7 behind. The desert planet, once filled with pain and loss, faded into the distance. Jonas didn't know where the road ahead would take them, or what lay in store for the future. But for the first time in a long while, he felt the weight of his decision. He had helped someone, fed someone, cared for someone, and in doing so, he had unknowingly opened a door to a future that was far more complicated than he could have ever imagined. The stellar drift cut through the inky blackness of space, its engines humming steadily as it navigated the vast emptiness. Outside the cockpit, the stars shimmered like distant diamonds, each one a cold, unreachable point of light. The ship's interior, however, was warm, quiet, and uncomfortably close. Jonas couldn't help but feel the weight of the smallness of the vessel, its cramped quarters pressing in around him. But it was the best he had, and at least for now, it was enough. He glanced over at Kara, who sat in the corner of the small dining area, her eyes distant as she stared out the viewport at the stars. Jonas felt the tension in the air between them. It was a quiet, uncertain kind of silence, one where neither of them knew what to say next. He wasn't sure if it was because of their shared experiences, the way the world had shaped them both, or if it was just the natural awkwardness that came with being stuck together on a ship with nowhere to go. But whatever it was, Jonas found himself wanting to break the silence, to somehow bridge the gap between them that felt insurmountable. "Where do you want to go?" Jonas asked, his voice cutting through the stillness. It wasn't a casual question. It was the question that would determine their next steps, the question that could change everything. Kara didn't immediately respond. She just sat there, her fingers idly tracing the edge of the table, as if searching for some answer in the dim light. After a long pause, she spoke, her voice soft but steady. "I don't know anymore. I don't have a place to go back to. The Red Dawn's gone. My unit. They're all dead. I was just trying to survive out there." Jonas didn't know what to say to that. What could he say? Survival was something they both understood. They were both survivors, each scarred by the past, each carrying a burden they weren't sure how to put down. He had seen it in her eyes, the burden of loss, the weight of being the last one standing when everything else had crumbled. "You don't have to be alone," Jonas said finally, his words feeling both awkward and sincere. "I've been there. I know what it's like." Kara looked at him then, her eyes sharp, but not in a challenging way. It was more like she was studying him, weighing the sincerity of his words. "You know what it's like?" she repeated, her voice cautious, almost incredulous. "I don't think you do. Not really. You've never fought in a war like mine. You've never seen what I've seen." Jonas' chest tightened. He wasn't sure if she was asking for sympathy or if she was just trying to push him away. Either way, he couldn't deny what she said. He hadn't fought in the same war, he hadn't experienced the same pain, but he knew what it was like to live with the aftermath of violence. He knew what it was like to be haunted by the things you'd done, the things you'd seen. He knew what it was like to carry a weight so heavy that it felt like it would crush you if you didn't keep moving. "I didn't fight in your war," Jonas said, his voice steady. "But I fought in mine. I've seen enough blood to know that it doesn't matter where the war's fought. It still leaves scars." Kara's gaze softened for the briefest of moments, but then she quickly looked away, as if she were afraid of letting anyone see the cracks in her armor. "I'm not looking for pity, Jonas," she said quietly. "I don't need anyone to feel sorry for me." Jonas nodded, understanding. "I didn't mean to make you feel that way. I know what it's like to be carrying something heavy and not know what to do with it. But we don't have to do it alone." Kara didn't respond immediately. Instead, she stood up and walked to the viewport, her eyes scanning the stars once again. Jonas watched her, his mind a swirl of emotions he couldn't quite articulate. It wasn't just pity he was feeling. It was something deeper. Connection. In her, he saw a reflection of the pain and loss he had buried for so long. Maybe they weren't so different after all. She turned to face him, her gaze steady. "I'm not asking you to carry my burden, Jonas," she said, her voice firm. But there was a trace of vulnerability in it, one she didn't try to hide. "But thank you for not just leaving me out there." Jonas didn't respond immediately. He just nodded, the weight of her words settling in. He didn't know what the future held for them, where they would go, what they would do, but for the first time in a long time, he didn't feel the urge to turn away. He didn't feel the need to run. As the ship sailed through the vast emptiness of space, they remained in silence, each lost in their own thoughts. The quiet hum of the engines was the only sound as they drifted farther from the desert wasteland of Tiberon 7, leaving the desolation behind them. Chapter 3. Unlikely Allies. The days passed quickly on the stellar drift, the routine of shipboard life offering little distraction from the unspoken tension between Jonas and Kara. As the ship glided through the empty stretches of space, their silence hung in the air, thick and heavy. They spoke only when necessary, sharing occasional glances, but neither was willing to bridge the growing gap between them. Despite the tension, there was an unspoken understanding between them. Kara had settled into the small space of the ship with relative ease, finding a corner to herself where she could maintain the distance she needed. Her warrior's instinct had never left her. Jonas could see that. She kept her distance from him, but not in a way that felt dismissive. She was just used to being alone, used to not relying on others. Jonas respected that. He didn't push. He let her set the pace, let her come to him when she was ready. In the meantime, he kept to his own routines. They didn't talk about their past. Jonas knew better than to press. But there were moments when he caught her staring out into the vastness of space, a distant look in her eyes. And he wondered what she was thinking. What memories haunted her thoughts as she gazed at the endless stars. One morning, as Jonas was preparing for another long day of travel, Kara finally spoke up. She was standing near the table, fiddling with a small device in her hands, her brow furrowed in concentration. It was the first time she had addressed him directly since they had left Tiberon 7. "I need to ask you something," Kara said, her voice calm but serious. Jonas looked up, his attention immediately focused on her. "Go ahead," he said, wiping his hands on a rag and setting down the tools he'd been working with. Kara hesitated for a moment before speaking again, her voice steady, but laced with something Jonas couldn't quite place. "Why did you help me?" Jonas didn't answer right away. He thought about the question for a long moment, trying to find the right words. There were so many reasons, so many things he could say, but none of them seemed to capture what he was really feeling. In the end, he simply shrugged and replied, "Because you needed help. It was the right thing to do." Kara's expression softened, but there was still a trace of wariness in her eyes. "And now? What's the plan, Jonas? Are you just going to keep me around because it's the right thing to do?" The directness of her question surprised him. He had expected something else, something more guarded, but Kara wasn't interested in games. She wasn't going to let him off easy. Jonas stood up from his seat, walking over to her. He took a deep breath, gathering his thoughts before answering. "I don't know," he said, his voice quiet. "But I'm not in a hurry to send you off. You're not a burden, Kara. And I'm not doing this because it's the right thing to do. I'm doing it because I don't want to see you alone anymore. I'm done running from people. Maybe it's time we stopped running." Kara looked at him for a long moment, her eyes searching his face, as if looking for something. For the first time, Jonas saw a flicker of something other than suspicion in her gaze, something softer, something he couldn't quite place. After a long silence, Kara finally nodded. "Maybe you're right," she said, her voice quiet. "Maybe it's time to stop running." Jonas smiled, though it was a small, tentative thing. It was the first real connection they had made, and it felt like a fragile thing, something that might break if he wasn't careful. But for the first time since meeting her, Jonas didn't feel the weight of isolation. For the first time, it seemed like maybe there was something more out there for both of them. They stood there, In the small ship's cramped quarters, the tension lifting for just a moment. The stars outside continued to drift by, an endless, silent witness to the quiet moment shared between two unlikely allies. The stellar drift continued its journey through the cold emptiness of space, the hum of the engines filling the small vessel as the days stretched on. Despite the awkwardness of their earlier exchanges, something had shifted between Jonas and Kara. There was an unspoken understanding now, a mutual respect forged in silence and shared solitude. They had both been isolated for too long, each carrying the weight of their pasts in different ways. But in this moment, drifting through the void of space, they didn't need words to understand one another. They had both been alone, but now they were no longer alone. The days became easier, or at least they felt more bearable. Kara, though quiet, began to open up in small ways. She would share bits and pieces of her past, the things she had seen, the people she had lost. Jonas did the same, though his revelations were always more guarded. He hadn't yet fully revealed the reasons for his own self-imposed isolation, the scars of his own past that he had buried deep. But there was time for that. They had time. The longer they traveled together, the more Jonas began to realize that this ship, this small, battered transport, had become something more than just a vessel. It had become a sanctuary of sorts, a place where they could heal, where they could rebuild whatever had been broken. Jonas had always been a loner, used to doing everything himself. He didn't need anyone. But now, the thought of not having Kara with him, of turning back into that solitary man who avoided connection at all costs, seemed impossible. Kara had become more than just a fellow traveler. She had become someone he could rely on, someone who had a strength and resilience that matched his own. She was a part of his journey now, whether either of them had expected it or not. One day, as they were cruising through an uncharted sector of space, Kara spoke up again, breaking the comfortable silence they had settled into. This time, her voice was more thoughtful, almost hesitant. "Jonas," she began, her tone serious. "I've been thinking about something." Jonas glanced up from the controls, his curiosity piqued. "What's on your mind?" Kara hesitated for a moment, looking out the viewport at the stars. "Where do we go from here?" she asked. "What happens when we get to the next system? Do you have a plan?" Jonas didn't immediately answer. He had been so focused on the immediate moment, on just getting through each day, that he hadn't really considered what came next. He'd never been good at planning for the future. He was more of a take it one step at a time kind of guy. But hearing Kara's question, hearing the uncertainty in her voice, made him realize that she needed an answer. She needed something solid to hold on to, something to look forward to. "I don't know," Jonas replied honestly, his voice quiet. "I don't have a grand plan. I never really did. But I guess I'm just going wherever the journey takes me." Kara nodded, her expression unreadable. "You're not going to keep running forever," she said, more to herself than to him. "I can't just keep running from everything. It's not who I am anymore." Jonas watched her for a moment, his gaze softening. He could see the conflict in her eyes, the doubt and the fear. She had been a warrior, a survivor, but the war was over. Her fight had no clear purpose now. There was no enemy to face, no battle to win. And in that emptiness, there was uncertainty. Where did she go from here? "Maybe it's time for both of us to stop running," Jonas said, his voice steady but full of meaning. "We don't have to have it all figured out, Kara, but we're not alone anymore. And that's something." Kara looked at him then, really looked at him, her eyes searching his face. For the first time, she didn't seem like the hardened warrior or the weary survivor. She seemed human. And maybe, just maybe, that was what they both needed. To stop pretending they were invincible. To stop hiding the parts of themselves that hurt. "We'll figure it out," Kara said softly, a faint smile tugging at her lips. Together, Jonas smiled back, feeling something deep within him shift. There was no certainty, no guarantee of what lay ahead, but for the first time in a long time, he wasn't worried. There was a sense of peace in the unknown, a sense of possibility that had eluded him for years. They had each other, and that was enough. Chapter 4. The Future, Together. The next few days were a blur of routine. Kara spent her time familiarizing herself with the ship's systems, helping Jonas with repairs, and generally adjusting to life aboard the stellar drift. She was a quick learner, her background as a soldier giving her the discipline and focus needed to understand the ship's operation. Jonas was impressed with how quickly she adapted, but what impressed him even more was the way she opened up in small moments, sharing bits of her past, her thoughts, and her emotions. They weren't just passing through space anymore, they were beginning to carve out a life together. One evening, as they sat at the small dining table in the ship's cramped galley, the quiet sound of the engines humming in the background, Jonas found himself staring at Kara in a way he hadn't before. She was eating a ration, but there was something different in the way she carried herself now, something softer, more at ease. It was as if, by being with him, she had allowed herself to let go of the walls she had built around herself for so long. And Jonas, in turn, found himself doing the same. He placed his fork down and looked at her, his expression serious. Kara dash. She looked up, raising an eyebrow in curiosity. What? I want you to know that you're not just a passenger on this ship, Jonas said, his voice quieter now, the sincerity in his tone unmistakable. You're not just someone I'm helping for the sake of it. I want you here. I need you here. Kara's expression softened, and for the first time, Jonas saw a flicker of something more in her eyes, something that reflected the way he felt. She put her fork down, meeting his gaze without hesitation. I know, she said softly. I need you here too. They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of their words hanging in the air. There was no grand declaration, no dramatic reveal, just the simple truth of two people who had been broken by their pasts, but had found something in each other to hold on to. Something that felt real. The future was still uncertain, but at that moment, they knew they weren't facing it alone. Jonas stood up, moving toward the control panel. We'll reach the Xyrath system in a few hours. We could lay low for a while, find some work. What do you think? Kara stood as well, her gaze lingering on him. I think that sounds like a good start. Jonas smiled, feeling the warmth of the connection between them settle into his chest. The Xyrath system was a trade hub, a place where they could rest, take stock, and plan for whatever came next. But for now, they had each other, and that was enough. As the stellar drift glided through the stars, leaving the desolation of Tiberon, 7 behind, Jonas realized something. It wasn't the end of the journey that mattered. It was the company he kept, the people he cared about along the way. And for the first time in a long time, he didn't feel like he was just drifting through life. He had found something worth fighting for. He had found her,